Okay, let's make a start. So I think first of all, welcome obviously everyone that's joining us both in as attendees, but equally our panel. As Adrian sort of thanked you already, rather than going through everyone and thanking everyone individually, I'll do a general thank you. Secondly, this, as with all of our LD Chat sessions, so past and present, and the series of sessions that we've got coming up over the course of the next month or two, will all be recorded and uploaded to our YouTube page. You can find that by searching on YouTube for Chiltern Teaching School Hub. We have rebranded in line with our sort of recent sort of delegation as a teaching school hub. So on YouTube, Chiltern Teaching School Hub, and you'll find all of our sort of historic back catalogue and our future recordings as well. So this is being recorded. We'll be up there within a matter of days. And so do please feel free to engage with that. Equally, we're on Twitter, and if you search at CTSH or at Chiltern Teaching School Hub, you'll find us and Chiltern Learning Trust as well. There'll be lots of activity on there, both during this conversation, but equally as well as we move forward from today's session as well. With regards to etiquette and for the purpose of today, at the bottom of your screen, around the middle of the screen, you'll see that there's a Q&A tab, which is the opportunity for you to pose questions that will be directed towards our panel. And equally, you'll see that there's a chat function if it is a case that you wish to engage in some discussion, but primarily the questions will be coming from the Q&A tab. So if it's a question you want to pose, please make sure we post it there and we'll get answers to those where we can. I know that some people have been asking about Twitter handles for everyone on our panel, and we'll make sure that they're sort of fed through back to people as well. So without much further hold up, I'm going to pass over to Penny, who's going to sort of take over from me at this point.
Thanks so much, and thank you to our participants and anyone who's joining us live, and also I understand that people will be watching this later as a recording. So we're going to be talking about anti-racism. Was it a fad? Are we making change? And this time last year, this was a discussion in every school, we hope, around anti-racism and what we can do next. So we've decided that we would like to give each of our esteemed panel members an opportunity to introduce themselves and to set out their initial thoughts. And then we will go to some questions. You're welcome to use the Q&A function to ask your questions, or if you'd like to chat to each other while you're listening, then please do use the chat function. I'll just say briefly, I'll be chairing, and how I come to this work is as a co-founder of the BAMED network. I'm a coach on the Anti-Racist Schools Award, led by the Centre for Race, Education and Decoloniality at Leeds Beckett University. And I'm also a school governor and a multi-academy trust trustee. So I'm embedded in the issues and thinking about this. Great, so if we go to Angie first, if you'd like to set out your thoughts.
Hi, thanks Penny, and it's really nice to be here this evening. So my name is Angie Brown, and I trained as an English teacher and swiftly moved into school leadership, working in schools in the southwest of England. So I've worked in rural schools, semi-rural schools and urban schools in the southwest, and I have mainly led on behaviour and inclusion. I spent a lot of time working in special schools, and spent a lot of time working with families who felt that schools were very hard to reach, because they were very hard to reach. And I would say that my career has been kind of defined by working with families who have found the system difficult, and it segued into working more with colleagues who were finding it difficult to navigate the system. So towards the end of my kind of formal leadership work in schools, where I was a deputy CEO of a multi-academy trust, I was gaining interest, having had some great coaching, in working with Black women, women of colour who were keen to progress into school leadership and were finding it really difficult to make that move, and also with women who were finding similar barriers to getting into leadership, and who wanted to know what it was about me that made me the unicorn that I had managed to become a head teacher and then a deputy CEO, and do that all with a small child as well. So I come at this work with a real sense of kind of wanting to de-unicorn it, but also in terms of the coaching that I do, with a real a kind of increasing sense that my work is not to gaslight colleagues into a system that is still structurally unsound if you are a person of colour, and to bring some real kind of ethics, deep conversation, meticulous searching out of what our institutions are actually all about, because it isn't actually particularly safe or comfortable for many colleagues who come from ethnic minority backgrounds to work in education, to try and progress through education, and then to try and lead organisations. And I'm tired of the case that it is. So I guess that's, I will set out one part of my stall there. Coming to the question, anti-racism, was it a fad, or are we making change? I found the question really interesting because I've been, I guess there are two things. I think there is something about the unsustainable nature of maintaining a focus on really, really difficult topics that I want to say, because I think it burns out the central nervous system. It certainly burns my central nervous system out when I have to week on week think, how on earth am I going to respond to the latest death of a Black person? How on earth have I got the energy or the wherewithal to deal with yet another of my coachees who is saying that for some reason, even though they've got a PhD, a master's, and several years experience of teaching and management, and they manage their own lives, that they haven't yet been able to make that progress into senior leadership, and they just can't say why. So there is something about the central nervous system that I think can't cope with this being an ongoing issue, that really kind of creates the want to collapse, because it's hard work. And so there is, I guess, there is a, you know, fad is probably the wrong word, but there is a sense of this being something, and the attention that we give it, and the focus that we give it, and the heart that we pour into it, that I think can feel unsustainable. That said, for many of us, there is a huge sense of continuity. And so I'm meeting school leaders who, like me, have been involved in matters around anti-racism in diversity, equity, inclusion work for a long time. I got my first role as a diversity, equity, inclusion leader in a school in Bristol in 2001. So this isn't a fad for me. This is my career. This is the entirety of my time working in education. And so it doesn't feel faddy. And when you combine that with the lived experience of kind of having to navigate the system as well, there isn't anything faddy about it. But obviously I have a window into the way that other school leaders are working, because I spend a lot of time now working with school leaders who, since the spring of last year and the murder of George Floyd, reached out and said, we're really concerned about this issue. My feeling, because I, as some of you will know, tend to go with what I think is in the hearts of people, is that as many school leaders did know that this was an issue, and they feel intense guilt and shame and anxiety about not having grasped hold of it way before the murder of George Floyd. And so they don't feel it's a fad either, but they feel the spring of last year was a way into being able to say, we need to do this, we need to do it now. There is a sense of urgency, and unfortunately, as with all crimes against humanity, it's kind of power to the elbow of people. So it feels as though there's a momentum that comes as a consequence of that horrific murder played out on our screens. I think it's also, and I guess this is reinforced for me by a sense that George Floyd's murder happened in the States, and we really don't need to go that far to find evidence of institutional racism and violence in Britain. And so, and I don't think that school leaders have been unaware of this. In 1993, when Stephen Lawrence was murdered, we saw the emergence of our own Race Relations Amendment Act, you know, the beginnings of the Equality Act, the public sector equality duty comes out of that work. And so most of us have been kind of working with that legislation for many, many years. I was looking at some of the history of racially motivated crimes over the last few weeks for some training that I was delivering. Unfortunately, on my to-do list, I have look at the history of racially motivated crimes back to the central nervous system issue. And Stephen Lawrence's mother said in 2005 that she felt that the government was still not doing enough to tackle institutional racism. And in the same year that she said that, there were 2 black teenagers murdered in London in racially motivated crimes, and those statistics continue year after year. In 2012, the data suggests that there were about 3 or 4 deaths a year, racially motivated deaths a year, young people, people in their 20s in this country. And I feel like that there is a context there therefore for head teachers knowing about this. This is happening in people's communities. No one is immune to the effects of this happening. We see it in the newspaper. We maybe don't take action. So I feel like there's been plenty of opportunity for people to engage in it. It took the murder of George Floyd last year for people to feel that they finally had the kind of wherewithal to do that. And I guess it feels like sometimes I feel a bit surprised that this is where we are, and that people are saying, "Oh, do you happen to could you do this work with us?" As though there's something kind of new and emergent about the work, which of course there isn't. And so the final thing I really want to say in terms of setting out my stall is that, as I said to Penny, and I say to anyone who will listen, I've been doing diversity, equity, inclusion work since 2001, and not specifically anti-racist work. And that's partly because of my own internalized racism, and because I have been working in a system that has various challenges if you're a black person and you're trying to navigate your way to leadership. And so there is a degree that I haven't ever wanted to kind of out myself as an anti-racist worker, but I've been very comfortable in the diversity, equity and inclusion field of work. And that's because for me, it has been safeguarding work. And so wherever I have done it, I have been interested in the safeguarding of people who hold multiple identities, which, identity is confusing and it isn't straightforward. And as a black woman, I hold many identities, and many of them are not recognized in anti-racist work. And there is indeed a hierarchy of oppression. And I see this time and time again when I go into schools. So I really appreciate anti-racist work as part of diversity, equity and inclusion discussions and work. And I am nervous about the polarization of those 2 areas of work, as though one is a watered down version of another, and as though if we are talking about diversity, equity and inclusion, we're somehow talking in kind of general terms. We can choose to see it that way if we want to, or we can be meticulous and we can be clever because we're educators, and we can think carefully about the language we use and the reasons that we use it. So I would encourage people to think about anti-racist work, and if they are going to do it, to be clear about using intersectional lenses to bring to it, making sure that that people of colour in Great Britain can be more than just the oppressed, can be more than just people who need protection as a consequence of something that happened last spring in America, because we are much more than that. And there are some really important intersectional issues happening for many of us who hold protected identities. So there's my stall. I look forward to hearing the rest of your stalls.
Thank you, Angie. And some really important points for us to think about around, these issues that aren't new and so on. So we would move now to Arv, and we'd love to hear from you.
Thank you, Penny. I don't know how I follow Angie. Never thought I'd be on a stage, a virtual stage after Angie, but here I am. A lot of, I think what Angie said obviously resonates with all of us in the work that we do. Just a little bit of background on myself. Having graduated 16 years in business in various parts of the business sector, and then spent the last 14 years in the education sector, retrained as a maths teacher, secondary, and then ended up specialising in maths. then the last 3 years worked with Chiltern on, apart from the math side, the Equality and Diversity Fund, which was set up by the DFE, running BAME into Leadership, which was again a programme to support, help, encourage various people in the teaching profession to go into leadership, to improve representation, but then very quickly realizing that actually it wasn't the people that was the issue. Like Angie said, you know, people that she spoke to, they were qualified, they had the experience, they had the motivation, they had the skill set, but for some reason they were not progressing within the organizations they were. So then started working with building those networks and working within the school cultures. Looking at the home schools of the people that were participating on the programs really opened my eyes in terms of the work is much greater than the individual that is trying to flourish within an organization. And that whole piece about the tone from the top became so important to the work that I started working on. And then last year, obviously, Penny, you coerced me, twisted my arm, and said, could be part of BAME Network, which I did, and I'm really humbled to be part of that work and to be surrounded by all of you in the work that you do. And then beginning of this year, I became one of the very few posts that's at a strategic level within FE, the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Manager for Milton Keynes College Group, where I am actually responsible across the group in every single nook and cranny, which is a burden in itself in terms of where do you narrow down, but I have no door that's closed to me. And that whole piece about tone from the top. Now, if I look prior to last year, I think it was quite clear there was schools and organisations that were doing things, and there were schools and organisations that were not doing things. There were ones that acknowledged that they needed to do things, and it's a bit clearer about the ones that were. I think what happened as a result of last year, and when we start talking about good intentions and pledges and all the things that came out of last year, was that middle ground became quite murky. There was all the people that had pledged and good intentions that may have sat on the side of no activity beforehand, no meaningful activity, started to become into the fold of we are going to start looking at this and doing that work. So that begs the question, how long do those good intentions, how long can you ride that wave? And when should meaningful action follow those good intentions and those pledges that were made? And what should that work look like? And is that a positive step in itself? The fact that we can now have conversations that we perhaps couldn't have had 18 months ago with some of the leaders that we're now having conversations with about the work that needs to be done that was not acknowledged before. So I think there has been movement over the last year, but I think that there's a danger, as I classed it last week to somebody, that we have lots of polystyrene icebergs out there that have no depth. But they look like the icebergs, like all the others that are out there that are actually doing that meaningful work. Like Angie said, since 2001 that she's been actively doing this. You've got Aisha Thomas, you've got Evelyn. There's lots of people that have been doing a lot of good work, and that iceberg you can see below the surface, and the scale of the work that's led to what you just see on the surface. But there are a lot of polystyrene ones out there, and the accountability aspect of that then gets hidden, in terms of we tend to look at the ones where you can't even see the iceberg, so there's no activity, so we tend to focus on that. But actually there's a lot of organizations out there that have got a pretense that there is work going on, and certain aspects of that really came out at the back end of last year, which is there's two aspects. There's the thing about the aspirations to do with the workforce, and then there's the provision, the learning aspect. There were a lot of schools that really focused, grabbed onto for dear life. We can look at our curriculum. We can start decolonizing our curriculum, diversifying our curriculum. We can start doing all of these things. But then you look at the staff that are delivering that, they're not getting that level of support. They're not able to aspire. They're not able to progress within those organizations, but it's okay. We're looking at the curriculum, therefore we don't need to necessarily worry about our workforce as much. Now, I'm in a really privileged position at the moment where 80% of my work within the college groups, that's over 1,000 staff, is about the workforce in terms of collecting ethnicity data, looking at lots of different protected characteristics as well, but then actually having a non-exec and exec sponsorship and feeding that through the organisation into every aspect and including curriculum. So I'm in a privileged position, but I also know that, having spoken to a lot of my FE colleagues and also within the schools, that they do not have that level of support. And that hasn't changed over the last year. That's the thing that really hasn't changed over the last year. So there's a lot of work that is well-intentioned that will not necessarily go anywhere because they do not have the sponsorship at the top of the organization. And that's the thing that troubles me, is the fact that in the course of the last year, with all the good intention and the pledges, the thing that actually needed to change hasn't changed. But the thing that that is quite easy to change, that low-hanging fruit, let's add resources for a 12-month black curriculum, let's do this, let's get specialists in to have a look at what we're teaching. That work started, but the other aspect, as you said, Angie, you're still getting colleagues speaking to you saying, why am I not progressing in this organisation? Why am I not able to flourish compared to some of my colleagues? So I think the challenge is now a little bit more complex than it was this time last year. The encouraging thing is that conversations are happening. And I think that is something to grab hold of. I feel that there are a lot more people that have open ears. I feel that there are a lot more open doors compared to last year. But in terms of, is there a systemic change across the sector, I would say that we are still a long way off from that, because a meaningful change has to come from the top of these organisations and institutions. And that's where the reluctance or the blockers or the barriers seem to be still 1 year on from where all the pledges were made. So in terms of my stall, I'm thinking about how do we drive that change from the top down to create the meaningful impact that we need, that will then influence how our staff develop, but also what our staff deliver in terms of learning. And then that encompasses all of those things that you mentioned again, Angie, which is safeguarding, well-being. There's so many, everything ties into that, but getting that right lens at the top and the right tone at the top has an impact across every part of an organisation. I think that's where the work needs to be, and we need to decide who is accountable for that. It's not the D&I lead in a school. It's not the person that's got a TLR for that, or assistant head that's been given that as an additional responsibility. This is every single strategic leader within a school has the responsibility to drive this work. It's not one person, which then feeds into that whole aspect of the fatigue that we feel. Me carrying that by myself, I know I will break. If I've got a leadership team that's carrying that load with me, and that load is carried whether I'm there or not, definitely removes that fatigue. And that's why that piece needs to change. So that's my stall. Over to you, Penny.
Thank you so much. So it needs to be driven from the top. There's been good intentions, pledges, some polystyrene icebergs, and there's still a lot more to do. Thank you. Over to you, Rehana.
And just thank you for including me in this conversation. Just in terms of who I am and how I come to this conversation, I'm a little bit on the outside, but also on the inside. So I think hopefully bring a slightly different perspective to this. I'm a governor at a local school. I used to be, well, I'm chair of governors where Arv used to teach. So I'm going to just take credit for how brilliant he is. I am heavily involved with Luton's mosques network, so have done quite significant pieces of work, particularly around Islamophobia. And I'm also chair of a children's safeguarding charity. We're called Faces, and we have a real focus around children from minoritized communities and how often they are unseen within safeguarding structures, or sort of challenges around how they are seen within safeguarding structures. But most importantly, I'm coming to this as a parent, as somebody who has children within the school system. Look, I'm coming after colleagues who have spoken really eloquently, and I perhaps don't have the eloquence, but I will have a certain amount of directness, I think, in what I'm going to say. That I have children within school contexts, and I am not convinced. We send our children to school every day, and we are not convinced of their safety within schools. And I'm going to break that down in terms of what I mean when I say that. When George Floyd was murdered last year, there was a clear local, national, international outpouring of anger and grief at his killing. For Black people, for people racialized as Black, there was an additional trauma in seeing that. But I think for Indigenous communities across the world, for those of us who are from ex-colonies, ex-British colonies, that violence and that the visibility of that violence was here. You know, it has always been here, and it was here again, and it will repeatedly hit us right here again. And of course, you know, teachers, school leaders, when they see that kind of brutality, and I think we've almost kind of prior to this last year thinking we were in this sort of post-racial world where nobody sees colour anymore, and you know, we all share these great fundamental British values, and it was a kind of a stark reminder that actually it's not the same. Although our lived experiences, from, you know, told us something different, I think it was a bit of a siren up there to tell people that actually this is very real. And I know, because I spend a lot of time speaking to them, that teachers, head teachers, felt the same. I think the challenge has been is converting those emotions into tangible actions. And I think, you know, we've talked about, you know, Arv and Angie have both touched on some of the barriers that are there in terms of having these conversations. But I think at the root of all of this is just the paucity of racial literacy on issues of racial inequality. So I could possibly, I don't know how many head teachers we have online at the moment, or deputy head, or SLT. And if we try to build definitions here, or ask for definitions of the difference between interpersonal racism and structural racism and institutional racism, most of us probably won't know. And which is why we have been unable to, in my view, make the connection between the violence that we saw George Floyd being, you know, meted on George Floyd that led to his death. We've been unable to make the connection between that and the experiences of our children in schools and the experiences that we have had in schools. And I suspect that some people hearing that will find that a difficult thing to hear. What I'm saying is that racialized children have a violent experience in school. So I am saying that. I'm not shying away from that statement. And it's violent because emotional violence is real, and it's harmful, and it's long-term, and it's damaging. And that's what our young people experience. And when we got asked this question about, you know, anti-racism, is it a fad? Well, Angie was perfect when she responded to this. It's our lives, isn't it? It's not going to be a fad for us, because our lives, the lives of our children, depend on change. So it's not a fad, absolutely not. But have we seen a change? Have we seen real difference being made? And I'll say no to that. And the reason why I say no, because since then, I'm going to give a couple of examples of how it's been patently obvious that we have been unable to make the connection between a murder in America rooted in notions of supremacy, of cultural supremacy, of civilizational supremacy, and of white supremacy, and how that transfers and how it is born and lives a different life within our schools. And the first example I will give you is of the incident in the school in Batley, where a teacher decided to show children an image of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and the image wasn't a benign piece of 19th century artwork or a coin or any other images that are out there. It was an image of a man, and I would argue that it could be any man. The fact that it was the Prophet, you know, obviously adds insult to injury, but an image of a Muslim with a bomb on its head is an image that's created in a particular time and space and socio-political context. And rather than asking us why those images are created and why we legitimize them, we had a conversation about free speech. We didn't ask about the violence that is meted out to Muslim children, who that word terrorist is used as a racial slur, why it was okay, and why, and actually the parents who were then also depicted within media and in popular discourse on lovely edgy Twitter as angry brown men. You know, how does that racialization happen, and how do we not recognize why that happened? But actually those angry brown men have since, in an investigation, been you know, proven to be right, and there was an investigation done, and you know, the decision was that the teacher did not behave in a correct and proper way and maintain teaching standards. But the discussion that followed from there, for me, was plainly obvious that we did not recognize institutional Islamophobia. We did not recognize institutional racism. And the second point, very contemporaneously, or the second example, will be that of the disciplining of Muslim children who raised concerns or expressed their grief, anger at the situation in Israel and Palestine. And we saw some horrendous and experienced, and I think we can all be honest about that, some horrendous practice by teachers. And again, and we know that there have been prevent referrals around it, some horrendous practice, but also what always worries me when these things happen is the amount of support that you hear, voices of support for that kind of discipline of children, of racialized children. And it is specifically because we are able to label them in certain ways and describe those young people in certain ways that we are able to condone that kind of behavior and those kind of responses. And so that goes to kind of my wider point in drawing some of this together, is one that I made a year ago when we had this initial discussion. I am all for decolonizing the curriculum. Of course, we need a broader curriculum. Of course, we need young people to see themselves, to see their histories and who they are in all of our glory. That needs to be done. But we also need to recognize that schools are institutions and places of power as well, and places of power that exert their power over the young people within those spaces. And that's particularly true for young people who are racialized. How do we talk about decolonizing the curriculum when we are in schools disproportionately excluding Black boys? How do we talk about decolonizing when we are hugely and disproportionately referring brown boys to prevent? I don't think we can, in all honesty. And I think that's a point of and I haven't even touched on the great big racist mess that is fundamental British values. We will perhaps expand on that later. But I think we've got to recognise that, you know, what our schools are, what's happening in our schools, and make those connections. And that comes from us being willing to engage in really uncomfortable, anti-racist, decolonial education before we start the work. Because who is going to teach my children this, you know, this new curriculum? Who's going to do it? Because if it's the people who, you know, and not to say I really care about this, but I'm not sure what to do. Well, of course you don't know what to do, because we need to learn what to do. We need to understand what's happening, and we need to build solutions together. I'm not here with the solutions. And Angie, I really wanted to say, in terms of what you said about diversity and inclusion, and I think I understand what you say, but I don't think they're separate pieces of work. I think actually they're deeply, I mean, they're separate streams of the same piece of work, but I think they're really important, and we have to push those both together, because we can't talk about being anti-racist schools if the leadership remains pearly white. You know, we can't do that. So all of those pieces of work need to run together, but it needs to, and I'll finish, sorry, Penny, I'm probably over, but I'll finish again with the call that I made at the end of the last session. Was this is about bravery from, you know, our predominantly white leadership to say, actually, we are going to go on this really uncomfortable, difficult journey of learning, and, you know, and make sure that we are properly equipped to do this work.
Thank you so much. So we need bravery, but we also need basic education for ourselves as adults to understand the issues, to understand society, to understand the extent of power that we have and how we're wielding that. And that needs to come first. Thank you so much. Over to you, Stephen.
Thank you, Penny, and thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here. Always an issue going after three very eloquent speakers to kind of follow that, but it's very helpful in kind of drawing together some of the things that I'm about to say that have touched on things you've mentioned. So I've touched on the kind of, you know, the pledges, etc., that were made, and commitments. And certainly from my point of view, I felt that you know, having grown up in a diverse community in Tottenham in North London in the 60s, 70s, 80s, I had some understanding, but it's not my lived experience in the same way. And what I wanted to do was to say, actually, it's not a time for, you know, it's not a fad. We all get outraged at this and then we all go back to our daily lives as system leaders. And Arv's absolutely right. It's got to be something that, you know, the change in the organisation can't be left to whoever is appointed to do diversity or the teacher in the classroom. It's got to come from the top. And so that discussion started with a group of chief executives of multi-academy trusts in the Eastern region. And if you look at the Eastern region, Cambridgeshire, Bedfordshire, Suffolk, you know, it's largely an 85% identify as white British in those areas. And so actually, from our point of view, there's a greater need to have some discussion to educate ourselves, because we are, you know, I'm a CEO of 21 primary, secondary and special schools across Cambridgeshire and Suffolk. My colleagues across that area are responsible for thousands of children. How do we ensure that actually we are engaged in that debate in a meaningful and educated way? So Tim Coulson and I started to talk about this. Tim is former Regional Schools Commissioner, CEO of the Unity Schools Partnership. Is how confident do we feel to actually engage in this dialogue? Are we informed enough to be able to have that? And we started to work with Professor Paul Miller, who's I'm sure a name that many of you will know, where we started talking with Paul from a research aspect about what do we do at the kind of one of his papers about, well, it needs to start with governance, with trustees, with chairs of governors, to actually start that accountability line from the top within the organization. And as part of that, we got together to form something called the East Anglian Anti-Racist Education Collective. And we need to come up with a snappier title, but it said everything that we wanted to say. It was really an opportunity to work with Paul very closely to identify how do we work as a group of educationists in the east of England, where diversity is quite small, to actually educate ourselves and to create a safe space for colleagues to have a conversation about what needs to happen. And I think Rehana touched about this, a kind of the racial literacy. Our understanding of that racial literacy in that part of the world is fairly limited. So being able to get Paul to do, he doesn't do presentations, he calls them provocations. So for Paul to actually do some of his provocations to challenge Tim and I to actually say, well, what is it you really want to achieve here? And what's your basis for kind of this discussion? We had to go through that kind of deep debate with Paul before we could decide how to work together. And as part of that, we've started to establish a program now. So we now have 7 trusts, 100 schools, 4 local authorities who are interested in engaging with us around this kind of agenda. And Paul's done some fantastic work. Some of you may have been online to see Paul's sessions, but we as a group, exposed all of our schools to Paul's Let's Talk About Race sessions, the unconscious bias sessions, the inclusivizing and diversifying the curriculum sessions as a starting point for future work, because we can't have that conversation unless we've started to educate ourselves. And actually what was really powerful is the number of times we said, well, that session's happened, or can we have it again? Because somebody went, they thought it was brilliant. And what was really refreshing is to see just how much people came away from that having to go away and think for themselves about their own perspective on these issues. And certainly head teachers in my trust went, you know, that's the most powerful thing I've heard, because actually I've never had to confront these issues. You know, I've never had to really engage with them. So for us to move that forward, we've now started to go, well, we can talk about it, but what's going to make the difference in schools? So we've been working with the Special Schools and Academies Trust and Fig Tree International on the race charter mark, because actually we want to start to embed some of this work in schools. As a CEO, I'm saying, actually, I need to put some money where my mouth is. So I don't want any of my schools to say, well, we can't afford to do it. So as a trust, we're saying, yeah, if you want to do it, we will fund it to make sure that this work happens in all of our schools. And the reason that's important, and Rehana touched on this in terms of governance, is that it involves our governors also engaging with that debate, not just the curriculum. Yes, of course, it touches on curriculum. And Paul's work on the inclusive curriculum framework is part of the work we do. But we also need governors and leaders to understand that aspect of the work. From our point of view, we also want to, Arv touched on this about the workforce. It's not good enough just to kind of work on the curriculum. We've got to work on the workforce as well. In my trust, we have around 10% of children across our 10,000 who come from sort of diverse backgrounds. Now, actually, they're not evenly spread. They're kind of clustered around places like Ipswich, where there's different communities. Out in the Fens, in Cambridgeshire, very little diverse communities at all. Only 3% of our workforce are from diverse backgrounds, and actually most of them are not in teaching roles. So how are we making sure that actually we're using that data intelligently? So how do we work with our colleagues? You know, if we don't know the data, we can't do anything about it. So how regularly are we monitoring that data? Where are the kind of opportunities in our trust? And I think it was Angie touched on this. I love the phrase, the kind of unicorn kind of moments. Yeah, how do we make sure there's a kind of herd of unicorns, if you like? So we've been starting to work on the Confident Executive Leader program, which is a program which is for BAME colleagues who have hit that kind of ceiling. You know, so they've got to headship, and it was, I think, Paul's percentage is something like 4% of heads nationally, 3%, you know, 3-4%. So those people who've got that unicorn bit, like Angie, that have moved into trust roles, how do they get into that? And one of the things that we talked about was actually sometimes you just need CEOs like me to go, do you know what, come and work shadow me for 4 days to give you that exposure into an organization from the inside and see how it works. But more importantly, let people in the organization see how colleagues can be engaged in and working with as role models for everybody in our trust. And so for me, we need to make sure that colleagues in my trust, however small the percentage, see us engaged in this kind of work, and that they are represented, valued, understood, and heard in our organizations. for me, I've got to hold myself to account. So when I looked across at our board of trustees, I can say that they were all of the same kind of backgrounds, same kind of, we didn't even touch on male, female. That's kind of, was taken as a given. And we're going, but actually, is there anybody from a diverse background that can hold me to account on whether we're doing the right thing? So we've actually now recruited 2 trustees who have not only great skills in terms of their day jobs. So one of them's a lawyer, one of them's an expert in virtual learning, which has been very handy in the last year or so, but also have an interest in kind of equity, diversity, and actually are taking responsibility at board level for holding me and my executive to account for the work that we are doing. So I'm determined. I take totally the point. There's lots of work to do. Have we affected systemic change? We're starting, and actually by using our influence as system leaders, by engaging with other system leaders, by actually being very public about our engagement in anti-racism and equity. And I take the point from Angie, this is about all kind of equalities and equity, not just about anti-racism, but ours was focused on, we are talking about anti-racism in this context. It's a direct thing. But we want to make sure that we engage more people in that to help us educate ourselves to be able to do this better than we've been doing it in the past. And that's my kind of stall. Thank you, Penny.
Thank you very much. And I think the thing that really stands out for me is we talked about power, we talked about coming from the top, and I think it's a good example of having that proximity to power, earned or not, and what do you do with it? What do you do with that? And how do you use that? So we're going to take some time now to think about some of the questions that have come in and some of the things that we would like to discuss in general. And one question that did come in, which I think relates really nicely to some of the points around racial literacy. There was a question from Naeem which says that the education isn't happening at initial teacher stage. And from my own reading quite recently, I've just been reading about the shift from initial teacher education to initial teacher training. So the education used to happen in universities and it used to be about the world and society, and now it's become much more technical. So teachers aren't really tackling the questions of how does society work and who are we going to meet in our classrooms and how do they come to be there. So Rehana, I'd love to go to you about this point around racial literacy and what things have you seen that work, or things that you've seen that are just appalling?
Thanks for coming to me first on this one, Penny. I'm going to be really honest with you that I haven't seen any practice that made me step back and say, wow, this is amazing. So I think there are small pockets of maybe a one-day session that you think, oh, that's good, that had some potential. But this is the problem, I think, with the way that we approach some of this, is that, a one-day bit of training, one-day bit of EDI, one-day bit of cultural competence or cultural intelligence or whatever other cultural name that we want to give it, without really naming the problem, without using the R word if we can, because that upsets people. And then we can move on because that's done. But I think, when I talk about education, I'm talking about real depth and breadth. Understanding the, I think for many of our school leaders, for example, can't really understand, when that word decolonization is used, really no idea what that means and why that's a problem, because they don't know why colonization was a problem, because we built some railways and we've left and it's finished. So not understanding how that process of colonization was an inherently violent one, how it's left its mark over there, but how it also came over here, and that, people like myself are only here because Britain was over there. and understanding that impact on kind of contemporary life in Britain, but understanding all of those processes. And I think until, again, we get that kind of real depth and breadth, I think it's really hard for people to be able to make the connections, as I say, between, you know, institutional racism and police violence, and how that also reverberates in schools through, for example, the Prevent programme. So we're unable to make those connections because we don't know them. So, you know, it needs to be, and maybe it's out there and I haven't seen it, but this needs to be a real dedicated, long-term and ongoing piece of education.
Thank you. Angie, were you poised to come in on that? Am I reading the body language correctly?
Maybe. I mean, it's just, I'm very interested in this, and I guess I have a slightly different view on things than yours, Rehana, because I think I'm working with schools who have put their hand up to do it. So it's always easy to kind of say, well, everyone's doing it, because, you know, I see the people who are. And what occurs to me in the work that I'm doing is that it's very hard for people to understand colonization. It's very hard for people to understand structural racism because it's designed as such, and everyone's in it. And so it is our job as educators, and particularly as anti-racist educators and diversity, equity, inclusion educators, to really be quite kind of generous about, we're all in this system and it has really got us all by the short and curlies, and it's really uncomfortable, but this is what I want to show you. So particularly with, you know, I work with lots of educators who haven't, because it's designed, the whole structure is designed so people don't join the dots between social housing and what's happening in their classroom, between health and what's going on here with people not getting promotions. It is designed deliberately so, and so I feel like the education is so far back and out into the ethers so that people can get a really good bird's eye view of this is how this operates. I don't go near the classroom when I'm talking about anti-racist education or diversity, equity, inclusion work. I don't talk about the curriculum. I don't talk about what's happening in the classroom. I talk about what's happening in society and how it has been designed like that. And then I start to see people, teachers, like light bulbs are kind of going, oh, right, okay. So that's why this has happened. So that links to that. And I feel like we have to kind of avoid, you know, and I guess back to my point about the central nervous system, we have to avoid these short-term fixes that are going to be, if we quickly put some brown people in the curriculum, maybe that will make everything better. And we have to say this is a deep commitment, isn't it, to unlearning what we have been schooled in, all of us. The methodology that suggests that after 2 days of this training you're going to have the answer and it's okay because you'll get your SEF done. To unpack all of that and say it's probably going to be 3 to 5 years, and then you might have a SEF that bears some sort of scrutiny when we look at it through the lens of anti-racism. And unlearning that, you know, letting people be wide open without an answer at the end of a training session has been something that I've had to really dig into, really kind of go, I'm doing 4 hours with you and at the end of it, you're not going to have an answer to this, and just be okay with that as a methodological approach even. And I think that sense of that kind of transactional sense with which people come to get the training needs to be unpacked and needs to be dismantled, because it isn't about a transaction. It is about co-creating society once again. It is about unlearning and rebuilding something. So I feel like some people, I'm lucky because the people who are up for doing that work are the people coming towards me, but I absolutely feel the frustration of being involved with people who are not ready to do it on that level. And I feel like I don't quite know what to do with the inquiries of can you do an hour on unconscious bias training variety, because, you know, we know that that's not going to get us anywhere.
And it's also connected to the thing of being educators are not so great at being educated. You know, it's about technique. It's about, you know, what does the research say is the best way to get children to get through these tests, because that's what counts. So it is about going back to what education is for and being critical thinkers, and for it being consistent. I want to just relate it also to, you know, we're all talking in agreement that institutional and structural racism just exists. It exists in society and in our education sector. But you can't ignore the fact that there's also huge resistance to this just being a simple fact from which we start the work, right? And that's coming, you know, that's not just coming from organizations like Don't Divide Us, or, you know, people who've taken it upon themselves to kind of try to help schools to resist. It's also coming directly from the Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities. You know, there's a list of recommendations, and those recommendations will be implemented. What do we do about this resistance to anti-racism, this anti-racism? I'm throwing it out to the floor.
I don't mind coming in on that, and actually picking. I agree with it. Actually, I don't think we hold different positions on it, Angie. I think I agree with what you say there. That, you know, once the education happens, we make the connections, but also on the challenge of it, because even as racialized people, we have had to unlearn it. So it's not impossible. We know that because we've done it, but we've all internalized racism. We've all internalized ideas, or I have certainly internalized ideas of my own inferiority, internalized the idea that perhaps if I behaved in a way that was more white, I would be more successful, I would be more acceptable, all of those kind of things. And we've had to unlearn that and detangle that from ourselves. And it, you know, it's a painful process. So we recognize, I certainly recognize how difficult that is. In terms of, you know, what do we do about all of these quite polarized conversations that are happening in terms of, you know, anti-racism, and then the anti-racism, the woke and the anti-woke, and, you know, all of these culture wars, should we call them, that that are happening around this issue. But I think there are a couple of things. As educators, it goes back to Penny. I think you said it beautifully there. What is our core purpose? And constantly reminding ourselves of what our core purpose is. And if we know that there are young people in our school who, and parents who send their children, as I said right at the beginning, are sending our children into schools where we're not entirely sure that they'll be safe, that's a failure of our school system. When we have got a significant number of young Black men being completely failed by this system that we have, we've got to question ourselves on it. So it goes back to how we honour that core purpose. But also, once again, my challenge to white leadership is it is actually your job to hold that ground. I think it was Angie who talked about how difficult this is for us as racialized people to have these conversations. And for somebody who spends a lot of time talking about them, I really don't like doing it. I don't like doing it because it is emotionally difficult, and it is often the reactions are emotionally violent, but we have to do it, you know, because we feel compelled to. But it would be, it is, and I should say, because I've experienced this, that when you have people who recognize their power in the room and use that power to support those conversations, then that makes all the difference. So again, there are people listening in who will know that the power and influence that they have, and you can either resist and look at your progress and think actually all is dandy here, or we can really look at the whole child, about what experiences our young people are having. Are those experiences different for some of our young people? And how do we respond to that as a school? So I think again it's about how we build on the anti-racist commitment that we have together, so that, you know, that we're all working together and supporting each other in getting the message out there.
Thank you. Arv, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I mean, and the challenge is great. I mean, I use some like personal metrics and also some other sort of like lines in the sand in the past, in terms of I look at when my father came over in 1963. He was a qualified teacher in India. He ended up working in a factory for 30 years. The portability of qualifications, all of those things, I can understand that. But then you start digging deeper in terms of which countries do we align ourselves with, and which qualifications do we value from other countries. And I know that even within the last 12 months, that people have come across from various countries, qualified experience, not being able to get a role in the jobs that they want. A couple of weeks ago on FE Voices, I spoke to Saida, who's the HR director there, came loaded with qualifications from Canada, born and bred in Canada, had to work in a car showroom, redid her masters, redid everything else to be then go back into a profession that she wanted to go into. And I think, okay, if my father had come over now, would he be treated any differently? Would he have had more opportunity now than he had in 1963? And I can honestly say I don't think he would. So we've got to question where we place the value in terms of qualifications. And now we're coming into a situation where we've got people that do not need to have qualified status to stand in front of our students to teach them, and yet somebody who's qualified from another country with experience cannot teach in this country as a qualified teacher. So there's a whole thing about values and what we value that's the underlying. So that's a systemic part of this. And going to the point that Rehana made in terms of the black boys that we are, and the black community in general, that we have, the work of Bernard Cord in the 1970s, the whole thing about educational subnormal. Are you telling me that in the last 30, 40 years, that all of a sudden that system that developed those ideas that it was okay to call children from certain backgrounds educationally subnormal, not because they were educationally subnormal, is because they may have spoken patois, which has been confused with they can't speak English properly. Those people that were educated then and that were educators then have only just left the profession. They are part of how the system has been created over the last 40 years. So we can't say honestly that those systems have vanished. We are a product of those. Our training is a product. The head teachers that we see there, that we're just about to have this big crisis about head teachers leaving because there's a big chunk of head teachers that are hitting retirement. They are all part of that system that developed them over that period of time, where it was okay to say that certain children from certain backgrounds are educationally subnormal. And we've got to be honest. And I think that's the point that we've got to get to, is having those honest conversations. And that whole thing about racial literacy that you're talking about feeds into that. That's what allows us to have those honest conversations. So people from all sides feel that the language we're using is safe, and that we all agree that that language is one that we can use to instigate these conversations. I know colleagues that want to speak but can't speak because they feel they're going to offend somebody. And that in itself is not right. So creating that platform, those safe spaces within our schools where we can have those conversations and include our learners within that. Our students need to have these conversations. And literally 12 months ago, having spent 13 years thinking I can't talk about race with our students, as a personal thing, as a thing in PSHE, I can. Yeah, of course we can. We can talk about race and racism. But when it comes about your experience as a student going through this system in this school, for some reason I felt uncomfortable having that conversation, not knowing where that conversation was going to go. And it wasn't until last year that a girl said when we were talking about poverty. She related it straight away to how can I come out of poverty when I don't get the same life chances as anybody else, somebody that doesn't look like me? How can I break my poverty chain? How can I get out of the situation? How can my father get a better job if the color of his skin is stopping him getting the job that he should get? That's coming from a 15-year-old girl. And that blew me away. And that was out of a poverty conversation, nothing to do with race. So what you said, Angie, yeah, you've got to step outside that school and you've got to look at where these communities are and where they come from and the systems that do. And that includes, like you say, Rehana, our white colleagues. They have also come out of a system that has developed them in a certain way. And that chain's a difficult one to break as well. So I think the conversation is much broader, but I think the place to start is to be able to be honest about it. And I think having something like this happening within a school would be a good starting point, where people from all aspects can stand there and speak freely about how they feel about this situation and what to do next. So I think we could be at that point. I don't know. I think we are in some schools. I think we are in some colleges. The work that Stephen's been doing across the trusts that he's engaged with. I know there's conversations with Anne, the work that you've been doing on that side. So I know that there are trusts that are doing it, but I think somebody put in the comments somewhere about DFE, that unless it has a DFE stamp on it, some heads just won't look at it. They just won't look at it. I know that, because you've got 101 things to focus on, and the ones that you'll focus on first are the ones from DFE and from the exam boards and Ofqual. That's what you look at first. So when those stamps vanish or don't appear on any documentation, then I think it becomes less of a priority, it becomes more of a luxury for some people. So I think there's bigger conversations.
Thank you. Is there a need then for us to, I think a lot of people doing this work are kind of circumventing the DFE or, the powers that be and are just getting on with it. But is there a place where we need to clearly state that a school that isn't anti-racist or doesn't have representation on their staff team and so on, then it can't be good or outstanding, and we need to pressurize Ofsted on that front? Will we get anywhere with those sorts of activities?
I'm going to jump in very quickly.
Sufian's shaking his head here.
I'm just going to jump in very
Waste
quickly
of
on that. Very, very quickly on that. So over the last 5 months, I've been bombarded by staff saying, have we got a policy for this? Have we got a policy for that? Have we got a policy for this? And I'm like saying, we've got the Equalities Act 2010, which underpins a lot of our work. So if Ofsted were doing that work, and when they look at the framework in terms of fairness, discrimination, all those different things, when they look at a school and 99% of the students are not white and 40% of the teaching staff are not white and all of the leadership team are white, and that's visit after visit after visit, the question has to have been asked, have none of your staff that come from different backgrounds ever been good enough to be leaders in your school? Or why are they leaving you and not progressing within your schools and others are? That in itself should be an alarm bell. If you had 30 students in front of you and 25 of them were white and 5 of them were from ethnic backgrounds, and the 25 always succeeded and the 5 never succeeded, as a head teacher, as a head of department, you would say, why are these students year after year after year failing in your class? But we don't tend to ask that question to do with our workforce. And Ofsted have got the framework. There's a legal framework that underpins all the work we do on discrimination. The public sector equality duties about monitoring and about development of staff. That's all there. They're just not following it. So I think they need to be reminded.
Yeah. So I want to just throw this to you, Stephen, because it looks like you've been able to mobilize a huge group of people, and people who have, again, I'll use this term, proximity to power. You've got some big hitters in there. Is there a case that a multi-academy trust or a group of multi-academy trusts might write that into their own? I mean, you kind of do, not mock steads, but you kind of check out your own schools within your trust, right? Is there some framework that you would, or have you already implemented some framework that schools have to oblige by?
Well, the starting point for us was something like the race charter mark, because actually there's the kind of, there's the kind of audit bit of that, but then there's a commitment from governors and from the trust to actually embed this into what goes on in our schools. And that's a starting point for us when, we don't judge our schools purely for Ofsted. We judge our schools for the quality of education that goes on and for the children and staff that are in it. And therefore, for us at that point, I'm sure my trustees will be saying, well, part of our judgment around schools, does it meet these criteria, of which being an anti-racist school will be one of those judgments, along all sorts of other issues around that. But I just picking up on Arv's point, I think, and something that Rehana talked about in terms of challenging to kind of white leaders. What Tim and I discovered in our discussions with Paul is just how uncomfortable it is for us all to have those conversations. And so there's a lot of willingness to have them. But Tim and I were both saying we've got CEOs who are absolutely terrified of having a conversation like this, because they may say the wrong thing or they don't feel informed enough. And what part of having the education collective is to try and get that safe space where actually it's okay to come and have those conversations. Because if we don't allow people to have the conversations and create a space where actually the kind of issues that we're all talking about here are actually on the table. How many CEOs have you ever looked at your workforce and wondered why? Or have you looked at this group of pupils that both Arv and Rehana have talked about? Have you looked at them in your school and considered why that data is as it is? And if so, what are you going to do about it? And actually, sometimes it's a kind of, no one's ever asked those questions. So why would they look at those things? And actually, that's the kind of provocation. I love Paul's word on this. We're not going to have a conversation, Stephen. We're going to have a provocation around this, because we really need to provoke some thinking around, why we do what we do, how we educate ourselves or de-educate ourselves, as colleagues were talking about, to actually be able to get to a place where there's some commonality of understanding to help us move forward. And until actually people like me and other people, nail their colours to the mast and say, yeah, we're going to have the conversation, then actually, we won't move it forward. And I am absolutely desperate for DFE to nail their colours to the mast in that sense and go, yes, we are, this is something we are going to discuss, or for Ofsted to start to embed some of that in, not in fundamental British values or something else that we have to tick a box, because my worry about some of these things is you end up just ticking boxes, and that isn't moving the education, moving the agenda forward. So I think there's still a lot of work to do around it, but for encouraging more of these conversations where, I don't know how many white leaders are actually participating tonight, but actually, it needs to have more people actually engaging who are happy to come and have the conversation in order to inform themselves.
Thank you. Does anyone want to come in on any of that? Yeah, Angie.
Yeah, so I guess just on a kind of, I feel quite a positive note. I work with mainly CEOs and executive leaders. They're the people that are coming to me and saying, can you do this work? And because, only 3% of us made it to headship, not many of them are of colour, so they're mainly white. And they are saying that, Stephen, they are saying, I don't want to get it wrong, I don't want to mess it up, I don't want to say the wrong thing, but I do feel like I'm not being asked to work with people who are a DEI lead who happen to be a person of colour who are not getting paid for their time. I'm working with people at the highest level, if you like, of the organisation. That doesn't necessarily mean that things will change quickly, but there are some sort of green shoots which are great. One thing I wanted to say though, and this is something that I really try to underscore in the work that I do with schools, is that, just back to your point of we do have the public sector equality duty, but what we lost when the public sector equality duty came into force was the beneficent quality of the Race Relations Amendment Act, which was actually about harmonizing relations between different groups. It was actually a gesture of, it isn't just, you're not just like kind of tolerating people being around. It is incumbent upon you to make sure that the people who are around get on. That's your job. And so in this kind of move to compliance, which is basically all the public sector equality duty is, I fear that we've got loads of people who go, oh my goodness, is our policy, oh, okay, oh no, it's fine, okay, we're compliant, instead of this creative work that was happening before then, that schools were all engaged in. When we had single equality schemes, we were having to be creative. We were having to go, what are we doing? Like, how are we actually inclusive enough? Have we got, how are we making sure that we have a kind of social model of disability in this organisation as well as a medical model? Like, what are we doing here? How are we making sure that these groups of people get on? And I just feel like so much has been lost, because the ethical dimension of this work is the, what good can I do for society with the power that I have in this field? What we end up with is a kind of, you know, Ofsted can come and check it, great, but we're back to compliance, and we can put it into, I don't know, the DFE can say some stuff and they'll say some stuff which makes it about compliance. And the compliance version is like the what if we get litigated against version. It's not the how do we build a better society version. So I'm really not interested, and you know, back to the anti-racist, the anti-racist and the anti-woke and all of that stuff. I just find that conversation also limited, so basic and so kind of tedious to work in. I want to be up there, you know, where the eagles soar, working with people who are interested in creating a better society, not with people who want to say, have we got everything in place? Have we covered our arse? It's not interesting. It's not, you know, this isn't how things are going to change. And I feel like the real challenge to this colonized mindset that we have about ticking everything off and making sure that everything's done is to work differently, is to say we can do really difficult things. Of all the institutions that we probably have the most freedom to impact on people's lives and the most opportunity and the biggest brains, right, to do really difficult things, to hold really difficult and sometimes what feel like really competing priorities, one in each hand, and say, and how are we going to make this work? And that's what the amendment to the Race Relations Act did. And if that spirit was there, I feel like we kind of need to go back. I think we need to go back a few years to what was in legislation and start there and start rebuilding from that place.
That's really helpful. And I think it also links to the point about, you know, provocations and giving time to speak and to listen, because I think a lot of schools I think that everybody gets along because everything's been repressed. It's so inherent in being British is repression. You know, we don't talk about those things and therefore everything's fine, isn't it? So then you do have to look for the signs of like, oh, but there's certain people who aren't progressing and there's certain people who leave. And so I think it is about having those brave conversations. And again, talking about the power, as a white person, if I hear something that I don't like, I have the power to shut that down, right? Because, you know, if I'm a white person in leadership, I can just shut that down and go, no, we don't talk like that here. And that's end of. And I think it's interesting, Stephen, the fact that you can kind of mandate structural racism exists. It exists in our institutions. We are talking about this. This is happening. You are coming to this. And there will be people who still don't believe, still don't want to be involved, but you know, you're there or you go somewhere else, but hopefully they don't. Hopefully they stick it out. So I think it is about that kind of sitting with that discomfort, but also having time to process and think about, how do I transfer that into action? What's going to change? And I think the last thing maybe we should look at is, you know, we talked about, you know, have things changed? And I think we've got mixed feelings about whether they have or haven't changed and whether they will or won't change. But how do you recognize, you know, how do you recognize if change has actually happened? And you know, anyone got any views on what you're able to see and how you see that? Or a different question around change that you'd like to ask?
I just quickly come in, just to pick up on some of those points and develop this sort of question around change, how we see it, and how we and how we, I suppose, measure it. But I think we've talked about kind of policies, and we've talked about the law and what meaning that has in this conversation. I think the thing that is really most important is relationships, and the power of relationships in facilitating conversations, in allowing for that. I totally hear, Stephen, when you say that discomfort about maybe I'll say the wrong thing. And I think a lot of that comes also from, we're all on social media, and you get those really, you always see these really polarized debates and then someone says something in not quite the right way, and somebody will say, well, you lost the argument now because you didn't say it in the right way. And I think that relationships are really important in developing productive conversations, because when we are in that room together, I'm not there to win an argument. You and I, Stephen, are both working when I talked about anti-racist solidarity, and right at the beginning when I said when teachers saw, what was happening to George Floyd, of course we care, of course they cared. And that care is there. And if we both sit together, recognizing that we care, that we're both perhaps at different levels in terms of our understandings and our experience of it, but we were both sitting in that space of caring and nurturing and wanting the best for our young people. And I think when you sit in that shared space, and when you make the effort to develop relationships and beyond the professional, so that we're not just sitting there because I'm your chair of governors and it's my job to hold you account. Mr. Rogers still here, and Mr. Rogers will say that he and I probably have very direct conversations. He doesn't listen a lot of the time, but we can have all the time. Mr. Rogers never listens, but I'm thinking his camera's off, he's not listening, he'll be off somewhere, he can watch this back later. But we can have those conversations because we have, we've developed a relationship over the years where we can do that. And that, hi, Adrian. But we can have that conversation even if we disagree, and even if it's going to take a bit of time for him and I to move closer in terms of our sort of position on any issue. I'm not just talking in terms of racism, but on any issue. So much better if you make the effort to build good relationships. And we think about that quite a lot in school context, don't we, about relationships and the strength of them, and how we can utilize those strong relationships in pushing forward some of this work. And for me, Penny, I think on a really, really basic level, I think once these conversations are normalized within a school, we know we're moving in the right direction. I know teachers of colour who will not use, I've used it a lot today, white, but who won't use that word because they think that people will get offended by it. Or if we talk about white people, that people will get offended. I know that there are, which is why I use it quite a lot, because it's okay. If it's, it's okay. It's okay to say white and no one's going to be offended by it. And if once we normalize these conversations, that we know that it's okay to say certain things out loud, we can start doing the work, we can start moving forward. And that for me will be the real indicator that actually we're getting there, or we've started the journey.
It sounds like you've summed up basically for us, and we've got about 5 more minutes left. But what I'm hearing really strongly is it's about returning to our core purpose. It's about remembering that we have a role to safeguard the children that we work with and the staff in each other, to really look after each other and really kind of lean in and listen. It's about those relationships. It's about educating ourselves first and uneducating ourselves with the stuff that we've picked up along the way that's just wrong. Angie.
Actually, Sufian was first. He had his hand up before me.
And Angie, I'm not even on the panel. I just couldn't help myself. I just wanted to get into a bit of it. So I think the etiquette would mean that I allow you to go first, and then I could try and dive in.
So I just wanted to say that in terms of change, one of the things that I think is amazing is fueling quite a lot of the work, is where student voice is now located. And everyone's invited, along with a number of other Instagram accounts that have existed to practice racist institutional racism in private schools, in public sector schools, means that we can do as much as we like of the patting ourselves on the back and saying everything's great in here, but actually our children are going and they are telling it like it is out there. And I feel like that's really democratizing the space and making it much, much easier for school leaders to come at it with a sense of, okay, well, unless I'm really honest about this, the honesty is going to exist beyond the walls of the school. So I think change is happening because I feel like finally our student body feel much more empowered to talk about what's going on. And I think that they know that they will be believed to a greater extent. And I'm really thrilled to see that. Yeah.
Go for it, Sufian.
I tried, I did my best. I was quiet for over an hour and I just couldn't resist any longer. I think really, one of the things that Angie touched upon it, the social media and the power people have now to talk quite openly about racism that exists means that you can't really suppress kids' voices in schools. Kids will out you now. That wasn't perhaps the case before. I'm talking about my own experiences, perhaps as a young person growing up, and my own children's experiences now. That way I would look at is, if you asked me 20 years ago, do I feel like the way people are speaking to me at a cricket game and I'm playing village cricket and all of the banter that was made acceptable by all the adults around me while I was a lot younger than them, I would have probably said, no, I'm okay with it. I'm okay with it because it's about, you wanted to fit in, you want to be a part of something, and you kind of say it's okay. I'm at a stage now where I say, actually, there's a lot of racism in education, and I think saying that aloud is really important for people to listen to that. Yes, we have racism in our profession, and I think that's really important for us all to kind of appreciate and understand that whole feeling. And the part we're getting to, which gives me hope, is the fact that people understand, people are starting to hear people's voices, say, actually, I don't feel a part of it. And I always say this, look at me, I look different. Yeah, and I'm telling you that there's a lot of times in education, I don't feel like I'm a part of the educational landscape. I don't feel I will be treated the same as other educational leaders. Stephen's got a far better chance as a white educational leader than I have. The thing going for me in my favor is I have good looks, but the beard, the color, that goes against me. And I know that's a challenge. And I think being able to understand and for people to be able to be honest and say, actually, we know that that's going to be a disadvantage. When people say to me, I don't know why would anyone think any different of you? Because actually 98% of the media portray men that look like me as terrorists. So it's going to be in the back of your head. So let's stop pretending that's not what you see when you see me. And that's not what you think about. I'm only okay to be a head teacher or a leader or a school leader in an Asian school predominantly because I can't inspire white kids, but all these white men can inspire white Asian kids and black kids. But I don't have the transferable ability to inspire white kids. Why? And I think that's something that we probably are at a stage where we're accepting. We know there's people like us saying, actually, no, you know what? Let's save the rubbish. There's racism. There's a massive issue. Let's try and do something about it. And I think the last year since George Floyd has allowed these conversations to take place more openly and more frankly.
Thank you. And that brings us to the end of our allotted time for this session. So if there are any last wrapping up words that anyone wants to say, now is the time to unmute yourself and leap in. Otherwise, it just remains for me to thank you all for an incredible discussion, and there's work to do.
Perfect. Thank you, Penny. Thank you, obviously, for everyone on the panel as well. Well done, Sufian, for keeping it just to those few minutes as well. So impressive there. Obviously, as with all of our sessions, as mentioned at the start of this session, it is being recorded. We'll do a bit of tweaking and editing, and we'll get it up on our YouTube page very, very shortly. So if you do want to find us on YouTube, look back at the sessions that we carried out last year, where we sort of initially looked at sort of the racism sort of aspect of things. Please feel free to do so. You can find us by searching Chiltern Teaching School Hub on YouTube. You can find us on Twitter at Chiltern TSH, and within the chat in this, and we'll put out on Twitter everyone else's Twitter handles as well, so we can continue this debate as we go forward. Without further ado, though, thank you, everyone. See you later.